Well, hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet you all. Can you see my screen? Wait.
We did, and then it went back to cameras.
I see.
Oh yeah, it's working now.
Now, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, as I was saying, so I'm Dominique Makowski. I'm actually French from a Polish descent, living in Singapore, but currently calling from Bali. And I hope that that the Wi-Fi is good because it's the hotel. So if there's any like issue, any freezing or disconnection, please like make a sign or something, and I'll rephrase, I'll repeat or whatever. So I'm very happy to be there and present basically the smallest half of our presentation that we were supposed to do with Panos. So I was supposed to introduce kind of the framework, and then Panos was supposed to talk about the project that we have currently going on about, that is bridging neuroscience and urban psychology. But unfortunately, so this will be for another time. So for me, to be honest, I hesitated about what really to present to you because I wasn't sure of your, of the background, whether it was mostly, people with architecture background or mostly people with neuroscience background. So I went with the formers and to do like a very broad introduction on one of the subfields of psychology and neuroscience, which is neuropsychology, and how it can eventually be used in the context of urban psychology, design and things like this. So that said, after hearing your presentations and your introductions, I realized that for some of you, it will be very, very, broad generalizations and very introductory material. So I apologize for that in advance, and I hope it will be still interesting. So, as you know, so yeah, I will start by talking about by basically introducing neuropsychology, which is my own background. I'm a clinical neuropsychologist by training, and then I did my Ph.D. more in cognitive neuroscience. And as you know, the different sciences are essentially, we can see them as separate entities, but we can also see them as, related in a vertical way, depending on the level at which each science field kind of focuses. For instance, on top we can say that we have philosophy, and within philosophy we have one of the sub branch, which is philosophy of mind, which takes interest in in consciousness, rationality, the idea of the self, these very high level mental phenomena, but with a philosophical approach to it. We also have the field, of course, of psychology, and within it we have the subfield which we refer to as cognitive psychology, and this field is focused on cognitive functions. So these are kind of conceptual entities, for instance, language, working memory, attention, perception, and since its beginning, cognitive psychology has been really interested in kind of understanding these functions and how do they relate together, and how do they form these kind of these complex kind of models. And what is interesting is that cognitive psychology, at the beginning, inherently doesn't make much assumptions about the underlying system, meaning that it doesn't necessarily require a human brain, actually. So that's why cognitive psychology is also used by people working with artificial intelligence, or basically just because it's a science of how a cognitive system, how something intelligent could eventually work. What are the different functions that are needed, how do they relate together. And then we have the field of, which is somewhat overlapping, which is the field of neuroscience, and underneath we have cognitive neuroscience. And so this is basically kind of the idea is to have cognitive functions, or more precisely cognitive processes or mechanisms, but here we really try to see how they work within the brain. So we know that, for instance, using different techniques such as fMRI, EEG, or many different techniques, we can see where different functions are kind of happening in the brain, and then we can also relate them together, map the different pathways, and so on. And then if we go down another level, then we are finding neurobiology, which is interested in the biological mechanisms, and then below we would have biology, then physics, and so on. So basically, approaching the brain, how the human brain works, we can do it from many different angles, basically, from a more biological level to a more very philosophical level almost. And in between psychology and neuroscience is where we would find neuropsychology. And the primary interest of neuropsychology is really the relationship between behavior, cognition, thinking, and thoughts, and the brain. So it's really like this interfacing field that is lying in between neuroscience and psychology. But there is one very important aspect of neuropsychology, which is that it's very interested in measuring cognitive abilities in particular in humans, using, for instance, like cognitive tasks and neuropsychological tests. And this comes from the history of the field. So one of the controversial and debated founder of neuropsychology would be Franz Joseph Gall, and this chap was has become very famous because he invented phrenology, the field of phrenology. So it was in the in the 19th century, and you have to remember at this time in the Enlightenment era, there was a lot of thinking going on about the human mind, whether there was whether it was a blank state when we were born, the tabula rasa, or whether we came with like some inherent abilities that God has put in our minds. And Franz Joseph Gall came with a very interesting theory. He said that the human abilities, the mental abilities, are actually located in the brain, and the more they are developed, it basically transforms the skull. And then by touching the skull of the people, we can infer and make inferences about their personality, about their cognitive abilities, and so on. So, of course, this didn't age well at all, and it has a very dark heritage. So it has been, very misused, and also, it has been summarized quite a lot to become these very obviously not real ideas about, oh, if you have a hole here and a how do we call it, and a bus anyway, so this means this or that. And it has also some some very dark history in terms of racism, and eugenistics, and so on. But nonetheless, so even though the phrenology as a field has been entirely disproved, actually you have, the original idea that cognitive abilities are located somewhere in the brain, and actually, that the brain, the way the brain is shaped is, related to cognitive abilities is quite revolutionary. And it's actually not that, it's not that it's not that false. It's just that, of course, the brain is not a muscle, so it doesn't increase with the development of an ability, and it doesn't transform the skull around. But the premise of it is quite, it's quite valid and it's quite interesting. And related to it was also the Gall's idea that basically all individuals, they differ. We are all variable, and this is pretty much from whether it is from birth or from development is another story, but we do differ on a range of skills. For instance, like here you have the everybody knows the IQ distribution, and the IQ is basically an aggregation of of a bunch of neuropsychological and psychological tests, and there is obviously big differences between people. And so how neuropsychology, which is the science of like how the brain relates to cognitive functions, and how do we measure human differences, how could it be related to urban psychology? So that's a very interesting question. I think it's just really the big, there is no such thing yet very well established as far as I know, but the idea would be essentially to consider, first of all, is the idea that the people are the center of the focus. So here, for instance, it would be taking interest in the people within an environment, or more precisely, it's not necessarily within an environment, but it's people under a certain experience. So it can be people watching some work of art, people just walking in some space, in a green space, in a crowded space, or whatnot. And the neuropsychological approach here would translate, because we would really try to see people as basically as a ensemble of different cognitive functions and mechanisms. For instance, basically containing abilities such as memory, cognitive control, language perception. And of course, these are very broad categories. For instance, memory, there is like autobiographical memory, episodic memory. Within it, there is different processes like storing, encoding, retrieval. So but neuropsychologists tend to see people as, not only of course, but as a as an ensemble of all many different cognitive abilities, all working together and interacting together. And then the idea would be to essentially, we would make some hypotheses about how and which cognitive abilities are involved in a given experience. For instance, navigating in a dense crowd or walking in a beautiful environment. We would think that navigating in a dense crowd, there would be some decision-making, planning, some visual spatial orientation kind of processes, perceptual vision, of course, emotion regulation, perhaps. So we can make hypotheses on like, what functions are involved under which conditions, and have the idea that, for instance, the more crowded the environment is, and the more this or that function basically plays a role or is involved. And then we would also measure these abilities in participants using different neuropsychological tasks. And finally, we would measure their behavior or their performance during the experience. So that can be, just people reporting on different scales. For instance, how I don't know, how beautiful they found the place, how excited they were to be in this environment, how much would like to go back, and so on. And then we would make basically we would investigate the relationship between these cognitive abilities and their experience, the people's experience in these, in environments, for instance. So that is one of the approach of neuropsychology, which is the correlational approach. Even though many psychologists would say that the first approach of neuropsychology is actually a more causal approach, which relies on brain lesions. For instance, here you have a brain with a lesion in the language area, and so neuropsychologists, they usually use these kind of people with focal lesions in the brain, and then they investigate what cognitive functions are impaired, and then they make hypotheses about how the brain works. But nonetheless, in normal people, it's quite hard to create brain lesions. It's not impossible though, like with some techniques such as TMS, for instance, or so on. It can be done, but it's not straightforward. So the other way is to rely on the natural variability, within the abilities that we have. So to give you now a brief example of how this is related, or how it works, like in practical terms, I can give you an example from one of my very early, actually my first research work, which was taking interest in the development of the aesthetic judgment in children, and in which we adopted kind of an approach related to what I just described you about a neuropsychological approach. So in this experiment, so it was done 5 years ago. So there is a, if you want more details, there is a YouTube presentation in which I was younger. So here I will just give you like an overview. The idea in this experiment was to kind of follow the Kantian view of aesthetic experience, and Kant, posited that a mature aesthetic development is objective and decentered in a way. And basically the idea was to go against, the beauties in the eyes of the beholder, the idea that, we all have different aesthetic criteria when we judge the aesthetic beauty of things. And what we thought is that actually maybe there is some, how to put it, maybe there is some decentering process going on when when judging the beauty of a piece of art. And it so happens that when you ask, for instance, children, usually, do you find this beautiful? For instance, this painting. Let's say, for instance, this example of the hair of Dürer, of rabbit. Many children would say, "Oh yes, I find this beautiful because it's a rabbit. I like rabbits, and therefore it is beautiful." So there seems to be really like a personal connection that people do when judging, especially children, when judging the beauty of something. And in cognitive terms, this relates to what we call the self-relevance processes, which is, the processing of anything in relationship to ourselves, really. So when I say like, I like this because, or rather, it's beautiful because I like it, it means that, the kind of the self process has been involved there, because we have made a connection between the thing and ourselves. If it's getting a bit, if it's unclear, do let me know. Don't hesitate to. And so we posited basically that children would be very, would have an aesthetic judgment that would be very, very connected to self-relevant processes, and then when people grow up and when they develop a more mature kind of aesthetic judgment, they would actually learn how to decenter themselves and adopt a more objective or neutral, neutral criteria to judge beauty. For instance, by using the symmetry, the contrast, the color, the knowledge of the artist, and things like this that can be shared, that are more universal than just saying, oh, I find this beautiful because like it's something that I personally like. And we thought that the cognitive process that would be at the heart of this kind of gradual disconnection between oneself and the piece and the art of work would be would be so-called the process of inhibition. And one way of measuring inhibition that we use in clinical settings, for instance, is to use the Stroop task, in which there are like words, color words that are written in another color. And basically the task is to say the color, and basically people have to inhibit the reading, the process of the reading of the words, in order to activate the perception of the color, or rather the elaboration of the color. And so what we did is, like, at least for adults, we measured their inhibition skills using this task. So we just, like, people had to say these words, and then we counted the reaction, the time that they took to read this, as well as the number of errors. And then we tried to see whether there was a relationship between the ability of the people in doing this task and what criteria do they use in order to judge pieces of art. But we also wanted to test children in this experiment. And because we know that there is the development of inhibition, basically there is a critical age around 10, 11, in which the development, like, inhibition basically starts to be very, very prominent, very used, and very, a very developed cognitive functions essentially. And before that, not so much. So our hypothesis was that children, sorry, I mean it's people, but like children aged 6, 7 would have an aesthetic judgment that would be really strongly related to their personal tastes, whereas adults would be using more objective criteria. And in between, for this 10, 11 kind of range, we would see a big differences. Basically, some children would have a more mature aesthetic judgment, and some children would have a more self-relevant, dominant aesthetic judgment. But then you might ask how to measure inhibition in children, and because actually, especially for the 6, 7 years old, the Stroop task is very, very, I mean, it's almost impossible to do, because it's just the reading fluency is not yet completely developed. So we used a task that is adapted, which you can see below, which is called the animal Stroop, in which children have to say what animal is the body representing. So, for instance, in the second row, which is the incongruence, which is where the inhibition is supposedly happening, they have to say sheep, duck, cow, and pig. And for children, it seems to be even harder than for us, because they really, like, the face basically triggers an automated response, and they have to inhibit the reading of the face in order to adopt a more global analysis of the stimuli. So we measured these inhibition skills in children and in adults, and then we saw how does it relate to the aesthetic judgment. And as you can see here, basically we found not much links. And what really was even more surprising, we assumed that adults would have this more mature aesthetic judgment that would be more based with objective criteria, such as, again, symmetry, the combination of colors, the art style, the quality of the painting, the knowledge of the artist, things like this. And it turns out that the personal taste was basically dominant massively throughout all ages. Even like most of the adults were also judging paintings based on, it's a flower, I like flowers, things like this. So there was very, like, overall, first of all, there was not a strong relationship with inhibition, and on top of it, it seemed like the premise that we were kind of following, that there was the aesthetic judgment kind of changed over the development, also wasn't very verified. And it's very nice because this idea got actually confirmed in pretty much in the same year that we run this, I think, this study, or maybe just after, in an fMRI study in which they found that even in adults, when people judge beauty, there is an activation of essentially the part of the brain that is like in the middle, that is which we call the cortical midline area, and we know that this part of the brain is particularly involved in all the self-related processing. So it's not a surprise that when we judge, I mean, it's like the neuroimaging findings also tend to support the idea that even adults, when they judge art, they use their own really like personal taste, personal history, personal experience, and so on. So it might sound obvious in a way, and it's true that when we think about it now, it's true that it's mostly maybe through expertise. When people actually learn about R and are exposed to R in a almost academic way, that they learn to use a different set of criteria. But it seems like for the majority of people, essentially, the self is very connected to the judgment of beauty, and this has led us to run other types of studies more recently, so that I don't have time to present now, about really the relationship between the self and beauty, because it's a very interesting question to see how beauty is connected to ourselves, basically. So this was just to give you an example of how we can use this kind of broadly speaking, neuropsychological approach in the sense that we are connecting here, cognitive functions, cognitive mechanisms with something else, and we are seeing how is it eventually related or not. And this is probably an interesting framework that could bring some maybe cast some new light on another field, which is urban psychology. So unfortunately, I can't really talk about this new project in which we are interested in the interaction between crowdedness, beauty, and basically beauty, crowdedness, and there was a third element. And and the typology, whether the environments are more green or urban. So this is our newest project. But Panos will present this surely next time. And for me, that's all I have. I hoped it was interesting. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.